Buy me, cowboy. I have experience. I can give you children, the woman whispered, barely breathing, like someone clinging to the last thread before falling. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to hit like and tell us where you're watching from. The barter market sat at the edge of a dry, sun-baked town, where the wind carried the scent of sweaty livestock, weary men, and sun-split timber. Golden sunset light filtered through the dust, and each footstep kicked up little glowing clouds between crates and wobbling structures. Merchants' voices sliced the air, rushing to strike deals before daylight disappeared. Zeke Callahan stood at the far end of the pen, his hand resting on the strap of his bag. He'd left his ranch about 2 hours earlier. He was looking for mule feed, fresh cartridges, and a few basic supplies. Hinge oil, a new skillet handle, and, if he had enough, some flour. He usually came late to avoid the crowd. But this time, everything felt packed tighter. Every voice squeezed his chest. Ever since his 2 brothers, Boone and Wade, were killed in a crammed saloon, Zeke couldn't stand crowds. Since then, he moved with constant alertness, seeing danger where others just saw noise. He passed several stalls without even glancing at livestock or deals. He had one goal: get what he needed and head back before the sky turned black. He had no intention of walking near the side platform until he saw her. A young Apache woman was tied at the wrists, head lowered like she was fighting to stay upright. Her skin was dry, lips cracked, body near collapse. Her deerskin dress, once adorned with fine beads, was now torn and filthy. The ropes had bitten into her flesh, and her breath came in weak, fractured sighs. Zeke stopped. Something in the way she clung to her dignity made him look. When she sensed him, she barely lifted her chin. There was no fire in her eyes, just a last, desperate effort to remain upright. Then she spoke. Her voice was broken, worn. "I have experience, cowboy. Buy me. I can give you children." It wasn't a real offer. It sounded forced, like a phrase she'd been made to repeat. Zeke stepped closer. He noticed dried blood on her forehead, a long bruise down her arm, and a tension in her shoulders that hurt just to witness. She didn't meet his eyes. She stared at his chest, bracing for rejection. "How long's she been here?" Zeke asked the man sitting at the post. "Since early," Silas Grubb answered flatly. "Took some work to keep her still, but she gave up eventually. Calms down if you knock her out." That tone lit a bitter fire inside him. "Price," he said sharply. The trader tossed out a number like he was selling an old bench. Zeke didn't argue. He counted the coins slowly and handed them over. He wasn't buying a person. He was stopping something worse. She didn't fully grasp what was happening, but at least the day's humiliation was over. Zeke didn't know what came next either, but he knew he couldn't leave her to cruel hands. Silas looked at him, surprised, but said nothing. When the coins changed hands, he stepped aside. Zeke approached carefully. He didn't touch her. He pulled out his small working knife and, with 2 clean slices, cut the rope crusted with sweat and dirt. The pieces dropped, and the woman clutched her chest, rubbing her wrists with trembling fingers. She looked at him, wary. He stepped back. He didn't know her name or her story, but he saw the fear that barely kept her upright. "When you're ready, walk," he said gently. She watched him, waiting for hidden terms, but he simply waited. She tried to move, stumbled. He didn't reach for her, didn't rush. He knew someone who'd been shoved too much flinched at every hand. Finally, she stepped down from the platform. A small move, but a vital one. And he noticed. They walked toward the exit. Zeke stayed 3 steps ahead, giving her space. As they left the clamor behind, he thought about what he'd just done. He hadn't come looking for anyone. His life was quiet and enough. Bringing someone wounded and fragile into it hadn't been part of the plan. But leaving her behind would have been unforgivable. She walked in short, hesitant steps, watching every shadow, shoulders tense, eyes darting. She didn't trust yet. But she'd rather follow his trail than return to where she'd been paraded like goods. They reached the edge of the yard, where the air felt lighter. Zeke turned slightly to check she was behind, careful not to stare. She was watching everything, not out of curiosity, but survival instinct. Zeke knew it well. He'd seen it in spooked animals and people carrying too much fear. He stopped near his mule, not moving further. "I'm heading west," he said in a calm voice. "If you walk with me, no one will follow you." She took her time answering, her face twisted with doubt, like trying to read his soul. There was still fear, but something new appeared. Relief. She nodded. Barely. It was the first choice she'd made on her own that day. Zeke adjusted the reins and started down the trail. She walked beside him. Still tense, but steadier. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. With every step, the noise behind them faded, and so did the weight neither of them realized they'd been carrying. The road stretched toward a quiet horizon, unfamiliar, yet gently safe. For the first time since sunrise, Ada Redhawk walked without a rope deciding her direction. The market noise was now behind her, like it belonged to another life. And with every footfall, her past scattered into the dust. She kept a respectful distance behind Zeke Callahan, her steps light but unsure, as if her legs still didn't remember what freedom felt like. He didn't rush. He kept a steady pace, in rhythm with his mule, giving her space to find her own. The sun began to dip, and the air grew cooler. That's when Ada released her first unguarded breath. When they reached a hill where the path opened wide, Zeke paused near an old post, worn by time and northern winds. He turned slightly toward her, calm and measured. "You should ride for a while," he said, nodding to the mule. "Your legs aren't ready for a long trail yet." She narrowed her eyes, not in refusal, but in caution carved by pain. She took a few seconds to size him up, searching his posture for any hidden intent. She found none. Her shoulders softened slightly. She agreed. She climbed up slowly, gripping the worn saddle horn and settling in just enough to keep from falling. Zeke took the reins and continued walking ahead. The sound of his footsteps blended with the soft jingle of the mule's gear, creating a calm rhythm that erased the chaos of the trading post behind them. Ada watched him from behind. He didn't turn around, didn't check if she was still there. That said more than 1,000 words. He wasn't keeping an eye on her, didn't treat her like a burden or a threat. He treated her like someone walking alongside him. Several minutes passed before Ada spoke. Her voice still trembled, but not as much. "You never asked my name." "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," Zeke replied without stopping. His honesty came with no effort. Ada came from a world where her voice meant nothing. She was used to others talking over her. "Ada," she whispered. Zeke nodded once. He didn't repeat it, didn't mispronounce it. That small act eased a knot inside her that had been there a long time. The terrain opened into a drier stretch. Zeke slowed as they approached a dry creek bed lined with stones. He crouched to check tracks in the dust. Ada tensed. She remembered hoofbeats, yelling, hands dragging her from her hiding place weeks ago. The fear came back like a punch. Zeke noticed the stiffness when he stood. "You think someone's coming?" he asked in a neutral tone. no judgment. Ada glanced toward the horizon. They sold me because I wasn't useful anymore, but one of them might want me back, and not for any good reason. Zeke clenched his jaw and looked at the dirt again. Prints are old. 2 riders passed through yesterday, heading west. Nothing fresh. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He spoke in facts. It was his way of giving her something solid to stand on. They kept moving until they reached a dip in the land, surrounded by juniper trees. It was open, yet sheltered. Zeke tied the mule carefully, set his bag down near a rock, and pulled out a cloth with jerky and a tin of ground corn. He didn't hand it to her. He laid it on the rock. A clear gesture. Respect, distance, free choice. Ada hesitated before reaching for the meat. She still expected someone to take the decision from her. But no one did. In that gesture, she began to reclaim something lost, the ability to choose. "Why'd you go to the market?" she asked quietly. "You don't seem like someone who goes looking for women like me." Zeke sat under a dry juniper. "I went for supplies," he said calmly. "Just needed food, that's all." "Then, why did you stop?" He rubbed the back of his neck and thought before answering. "I saw someone who shouldn't have been there." That was enough. He didn't explain further. Ada ate slowly, knowing the body suffers when it takes too much after too little. Hunger had taught her that. Zeke watched the hills, the wind in the brittle branches, the light slipping over the ridges. She watched him, too. There was something in his shoulders. An old weight, the kind that comes from carrying ghosts. It wasn't just about saving her, it ran deeper. Ada recognized that kind of burden, the kind of pain time doesn't erase. "You look like someone who left something behind," she whispered. Zeke took a while to answer, his eyes fixed on the distance. "Yeah, a long time ago. Doesn't matter now." "It does," she said, unsure where the certainty came from. "Things don't disappear just because time passes." Zeke glanced sideways at her. In that look, there was more truth than in 1,000 confessions. And then she understood. The way he moved quietly, like someone who expected loss before it happened. And she knew that way of living too well. Evening turned to night. The cold began to settle in the ground. Zeke gathered fallen branches and built a fire. He didn't ask if she wanted warmth. He did it because her skin still shivered. Ada edged closer, holding her hands out to the flames. The heat gave her back some breath. A question, held back for hours, finally escaped. "Where are you taking me?" Zeke tightened one of his bootlaces and looked at her. "To my place. Far from here. You'll be safe. And what do you expect from me?" The question came from the soul, like an old scar. "Nothing," he said. She waited, searching for the condition, the hidden price. But he said nothing else. "Nothing?" she echoed, not believing it. "Nothing," he repeated, steady. And something inside Ada let go, like an invisible rope snapping loose. She'd spent so long bracing for the trap that its absence left her off balance. It felt strange for no one to demand anything of her. They sat in front of the fire without speaking. The silence was soft, clean. No need to fake strength. When the stars filled the sky, Zeke tilted down his hat brim and murmured, "Get some rest. We head out early." Ada Redhawk lay a few steps from the fire, wrapped in the blanket he'd left her. She watched him until sleep took her. Zeke Callahan stayed awake a while longer, alert for any sound that might break the calm. No one came. No one searched for them. and she slept without expecting chains when she woke. Dawn slid in with a soft light, gilding the dry branches of the junipers. The embers still gave off heat. Zeke was already sitting near a rock, hat tipped back, scanning the horizon with the same focus he'd had when leaving the market. Ada opened her eyes, confused at first, recalling the place where she'd been taken. But seeing him nearby brought reality back. The tension in her shoulders eased. She was no longer chained, no longer a commodity. And for the first time since being torn from her people, the morning didn't bring fear, but continuity. He said nothing, but gave a slight nod, acknowledging she was awake, without stepping closer than he needed. Ada's stomach growled. A hunger she'd learned to ignore. Zeke noticed the faint tremble in her hands as she sat up. He didn't say a word, just pulled a small pouch of cornmeal and dried berries from his bag and placed it on a rock between them. He kept his distance. It was his way of reminding her every choice now belonged to her. Ida didn't wait long before taking the food. Her fingers brushed the cloth wrapping, and that's when she asked the question that had lived inside her since the day before. "Why do you always leave things there instead of handing them to me?" Zeke shrugged, no fuss about it. "You've already had too many hands on you," he said calmly. "I figure you don't need any more, unless you ask for it." The answer hit harder than she expected. She had assumed it was just a precaution, but knowing he did it out of respect tightened her throat. She'd been pushed, grabbed, handled like a thing. That voluntary distance was so new, it hurt. As she ate, Zeke checked on the mule. He touched its legs, tightened the girth, adjusted the leather straps. He did it without hurry, with hands that knew the work in silence. The quiet between them wasn't rejection. It was the habit of those who've lived many years in solitude. When she finished the last bite, she asked, "How far is your place?" "A day and a half," he said. "More if the ground's soft." "And when we get there?" Zeke straightened up. "You rest, then you decide what you want to do." The clarity of his words stopped her cold. He wasn't claiming her. He wasn't setting her course. He was offering space. Ada folded the blanket and laid it beside the mule. Zeke passed her a canteen, just close enough for her to grab it without touching him. Ada drank slowly. The cold water felt heavy in her empty stomach, but gave her air again. Once they were ready, he started down the path. Ada walked a few paces behind until he turned his head. "You're stronger than yesterday," he said. "You can ride or walk. Your choice." "I'll walk," she replied. It wasn't stubbornness. It was telling her body that it no longer moved by someone else's command. They moved through open land. Low brush offered small shadows, and the breeze stirred dry grass like a golden carpet. The landscape shifted with the sun, gray at first, then beige, then bright gold. Ada watched everything, every stone, every bend, every line of the horizon. She wanted to memorize the route, in case one day she had to come back on her own. Zeke glanced at her from the side. "You think they'll come for you?" "Could be," she admitted. "The last man who traded me said I was worth more out there than with him." Zeke clenched his jaw and stopped to study a dry crack in the earth. "If anyone comes looking, they won't get close. I know this land better than they do." Ada wanted to believe him, but fear still crawled down her back. "Which way did you come to the market?" she asked. "I want to know if they could track us." "From the north," he said. "Rocky ground. Tracks don't last. No one's following us from there." That eased one of the invisible weights she carried, the same doubt any listener might have. Could they find her? Zeke was already thinking a step ahead, anticipating danger before it showed up. After another hour, Zeke paused where the earth had been disturbed. He crouched down, ran his knuckles through the dust, shifted the soil. "What do you see?" Ada asked. "Fresh print," he whispered. "One rider passed after sunrise. Horse is dragging a leg. It's tired." That skill, reading the land, the time, the movement, needed no explaining. He knew the ground like someone knows an old wound. "He wasn't headed our way," he added. "Just crossed the path." Ada noticed the way Zeke moved. He wasn't worried, but he wasn't ignoring it either. He didn't believe in luck. He trusted what he saw, what he'd learned the hard way. They walked until the sun rose higher and found a cluster of big rocks that gave some shade. Zeke pointed to the spot. Ada sat down with relief, stretching her legs. The change in pace eased her muscles. Zeke removed his hat, wiped the sweat. She looked at him sincerely and asked what she hadn't dared the night before. "Why do you live alone?" Zeke didn't answer right away. He finished checking his gear, tightened the straps, then sat nearby. He tapped his knee with his fingers, then finally said, "After my brothers died, nothing felt right back there. Folks kept asking questions I didn't want to answer, and there wasn't nothing left worth staying for. So I left." He didn't dress it up, didn't hide it, just said it straight. That moved Ada more than any long story could. She understood. She came from a broken place, too. "You think your brothers would have wanted to see you like this? Alone?" Zeke let the air out slowly. "I don't know what they would have wanted." She didn't press him. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of moi where wounds could breathe without hiding. When they started walking again, the landscape changed. In the distance, a trail of dust rose. "Riders," Ada whispered, tense. Zeke narrowed his eyes. "One," he said. "Too far to tell which way he's going. Let's head up to the ridge first." She followed without hesitation. From the top, the valley opened wide and clean. Zeke Callahan watched the rider's movement with eyes weathered by years on the trail. "He's heading south," he said, calm. "Ain't coming toward us." His tone was enough. Steady, no fuss. The fear in Ada Redhawk's chest deflated. She lowered her head, ashamed of being scared so quickly. Zeke said nothing. He just adjusted his hat brim and kept moving forward, giving her space to gather her dignity. As evening fell, they found a narrow gap between two wind-worn bluffs. It was tight, quiet, and safe, perfect for the night without exposure. Ada sat on the stone, still warm from the sun, and finally asked the question every listener would want answered. "Why didn't you turn me over to the sheriff? Or some mission? Or anyone?" Zeke paused, arms full of firewood. "Because in those places, they make choices for you," he said, "and you've already had too many people making decisions you never asked for." Ada's voice trembled before she could stop it. She looked away, trying to hide the lump in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her about freedom before. No one had ever considered her capable of choosing anything for herself. As the fire crackled quietly inside the narrow canyon, Ada realized this journey was stirring something deep within her. It wasn't just the protection that moved her. It was the possibility of choosing. She lay down near the fire. Her breathing slowed, evened out, like her body finally remembered it could rest. Zeke stayed awake, listening to the wind and the sounds of the ravine. It wasn't paranoia. It was memory. And for the first time since she was captured, Ada felt that maybe tomorrow wouldn't mean running, but the beginning of something new. Something she couldn't name yet, but something she was willing to lean into. The night faded little by little, letting in a pale strip of light. Ada opened her eyes. She felt the cold on her back. The fire had mostly gone out, but a few embers still glowed. Zeke sat a few feet away, sharpening a small blade with steady motions. His face looked calm, though he never let his guard down. He looked up for a second, just long enough to make sure she was awake. That single gesture was enough. He didn't invade, didn't demand. He simply confirmed she was still choosing to be there. Ada nodded, still groggy. The silence between them wasn't rough anymore. It wasn't full trust either. It was something fragile, hanging just barely between them. A new thread. She wrapped herself in the blanket and looked toward the canyon's entrance. The ground felt unfamiliar. It hurt, not knowing where they'd taken her the day she was caught. "Which path leads back to my people?" she asked cautiously. "If I ever return, I want to know how." Zeke placed the knife on his knee and broke a small twig. He started drawing in the dirt. "Your folks used to stay near the high mesa, right?" "Yes. They moved a lot, but yes." Zeke drew a straight line. "Then you came in from the east. We're heading northwest. To go back, you'd need to cross 2 ridges and a deep, dry wash." Ada swallowed hard. "Not safe alone." She memorized the drawing in silence. And she understood something new. Zeke didn't know this land like an owner, but like a man who's walked it to survive. When they resumed walking, Ada moved beside him instead of behind. It wasn't a decision. It just happened. The trail narrowed between rocks. Walking single file no longer made sense. Zeke adjusted his pace without saying a word. They climbed a slope that opened to a valley of rolling bluffs. Ada paused halfway up and pointed toward a group of aspens in the distance. "That's where they held me, last time, before selling me." Her voice didn't shake from exhaustion, but from memory. Zeke looked without speaking, without asking for more. He studied the place with eyes that knew how to read a valley. "No one's there now. Tracks are long gone. It's empty." Relief spread through her body. Her hands relaxed. The tightness faded. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't need to. They continued until the trail dipped between thick stone walls. Shadow covered them. Then Ada saw it. A faint symbol carved into the rock. A warning sign from her people. She touched it with her fingers. "It's not old. Maybe 2 moons," she whispered. Zeke studied it calmly. "Means someone made it out." He didn't smile, but something in his face softened. For Ada, it was the first real proof. A sign that someone had passed through, leaving a trace. "If someone survived, maybe my sister did too," she murmured. Zeke took the mule's reins, speaking low. "You'll know when it's time." They weren't empty promises, just a simple truth, spoken with care. They continued along the narrow pass. Suddenly, Zeke raised his hand. Silence. Ada stopped instantly. He pointed to a depression in the soil. 2 footprints marked the damp earth. And in that quiet gesture, Ada understood something important. The danger was still real, but she was no longer alone. "Fresh," Zeke murmured, crouching. "No more than an hour." The direction wasn't clear yet, but the size and spacing told him enough. They moved fast, not coming toward us, heading for the plains. Ada saw him squint toward the distance. She felt her heartbeat in her ears. What if they come back? "They won't," he said, certain. "They just passed through. If they were looking for us, they would have stopped at the fork we left behind." That certainty eased the tightness in her chest. And she realized something else. Zeke read the land the way others read books. He could tell danger from calm. As they exited the rocky pass, the path opened wide. The wind lifted her loose braid. Ada tucked it back, embarrassed. Zeke noticed, but said nothing, only added, "When we get to my place, there's water nearby. You can wash, cut your hair if you want, or just rest in the shade." Ada stopped, looked at him, surprised. "You already thought about that?" "I've lived there long enough to know what someone needs on their first day," he said. And then she understood. Maybe she wasn't the first person Zeke had welcomed to his refuge. Maybe just a few. Maybe only once before. But enough for Zeke Callahan to know that the first hours of freedom can overwhelm someone who's lived with constant fear. Ada Redhawk wondered how many had passed through that shelter. If any had stayed, if they'd all gone their own way. She didn't ask. Not yet. They continued until they reached a natural overlook where Zeke stopped. From there, the land sloped gently toward a distant forest of pines. Ada stepped beside him and shaded her eyes from the glare. "You said you've lived alone for years," she said quietly. "Why'd you stay in that place, instead of keep moving?" Zeke kicked a small stone and watched it bounce down the slope. "The farther I went, the less anything made sense. That cabin doesn't ask anything of me, doesn't judge. It's the only place where nothing chases me." Ada took in that answer like another piece of the puzzle that was him. She no longer saw him as a man running from something, but as a man who had found the only corner that asked him for no explanations. Then a more practical, more urgent doubt rose in her. "What will people think if they see me with you?" Zeke didn't hesitate. "They won't see you. My place isn't near any town. Anyone who passes by is already lost." That thought eased her shoulders. No one would point at her. No one would lay claim to her. The light stretched across the land, casting long shadows as they came down from the ridge. Ada walked closer to him, not out of fear, but because distance no longer made sense. She noticed how he tightened the rope slightly when the ground was loose. How he leaned his body toward her when crossing unstable patches. They reached a flat stretch as the sun was nearly gone. Zeke studied the grass, listened to the wind, and nodded. "We camp here. Enough cover, and far from the creek." She gathered dry twigs while he lit the fire. When the flames took hold, they sat near it. The sky melted from oranges into deep blues. And for the first time since she was taken from her people, Ada felt solid ground beneath her feet. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. Zeke saw it in her eyes. And though he didn't smile, something in his face eased, as if the weight he carried was no longer his alone. When night fully settled, the silence became a space they shared, not of distance, but of learning, as if both were building something they barely knew how to hold. The next morning the fire was just a faint ring of ash when Zeke opened his eyes. The light was filtering slowly through the clearing. Ada sat beside a log, wrapped in the blanket that still held a bit of warmth. She didn't know he was already watching her. She looked toward the tree line, alert, ears sharp. Zeke noticed she no longer flinched at every crackle, no longer held her breath like she had that first night. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her body. He sat up, brushed off the dust, and stretched his back. Ada turned when she heard him, and the hardness in her eyes softened when she recognized him. "Did you get any sleep?" she asked. "Enough," he replied. It wasn't true, but he didn't add more. He'd spent the night listening, separating in his mind which sounds meant danger and which were just branches in the wind. She didn't press him. She already understood. Rest, for him, took another shape. While Zeke prepared the mule, Ada picked up small stones and placed them on the ground, forming a pattern. 2 lines to the northwest. 1 deep mark pointing the way. Zeke stopped. "Are you leaving a sign?" "No, just practicing. It's been months since I've marked anything. My hands are clumsy." She ran her thumb over the line. "If someone from my band sees this, they'll know we walked, that it wasn't a trap." Zeke nodded. And that answered an unspoken question. Ada still knew how to speak with her people. She was reclaiming that language, stone by stone. They resumed the march, crossing dry grass that crunched underfoot. The air warmed faster than it had in recent days. It pushed away the last of the morning chill. Ada walked beside him naturally, Zeke noticed. Her breathing was steady. She took in air without pain. She no longer dragged her body. She lived inside it. He lifted his hand. Ada stopped at once. She had learned that gesture by now. Zeke crouched down, touched a shallow dent in the soil. "Someone was here before dawn," he said. "Just one, light step." Ada's stomach tightened, but not with panic. "You think they saw us?" "No, if they had, there'd be more tracks." He scanned the area with precision. "Maybe a hunter, or someone running, or nothing." He didn't say it as a threat, just a possibility, a fair one. That calmed her. Zeke didn't leap to fear. He measured, he observed. And that, she was starting to value more than anything else. They kept moving until the grass opened to wide stretches dotted with sage. The open space brought relief. No dark corners, no lurking shadows. And there, under that clean sky, a new thought came to her. A question about the future, about what it meant to walk beside someone who never once called her his. A future that, for the first time, didn't feel forced, but possible. As the path opened westward and the brush grew low, Ada finally voiced the question she'd held in for hours. "If your home is so far, how do you get what you need?" Zeke adjusted the mule's rope before answering. "Every few months I ride down to a settlement, usually farther than where we crossed paths. I trade hides, tools, a little meat." He paused. "I don't eat much," he murmured. "Don't need much either." It didn't surprise her, but it filled in a space she hadn't yet understood. How did he survive with no neighbors, no words? What did he do when fever came? How did he face winters? How did he keep the loneliness from swallowing him whole? That thought stuck like a thorn under the skin. By midday, the sun was straight above. The shadows had thinned to lines at their feet. Zeke slowed his pace. Without looking at her, he murmured, "You're quiet today." "So are you," she replied. He let out a soft breath. Something like a smile that never fully showed. Maybe just a few had passed this trail before. Maybe only once. But enough for Zeke Callahan to know that the first hours of freedom overwhelm anyone who's lived too long under fear. Ada Redhawk wondered how many had walked this same road, if any had stayed, or if they had all chosen their own paths. She didn't ask. Not yet. They walked until they reached a natural rise where Zeke stopped. From there, the land sloped gently into a distant pine forest. Ida stepped beside him, raising her hand to shield her eyes from the sun. "You said you've lived alone for a long time," she said. "Why did you stay in that place instead of moving on?" Zeke kicked a stone and watched it roll downhill. "The farther I kept going, the less things made sense. That cabin doesn't ask anything of me. It's the only place where nothing chases me." Ada held on to those words like a new piece of the puzzle. She no longer saw him as someone running, but as a man who had chosen the one corner that didn't push him. Then another thought surfaced, more real, more immediate. "What would folks think if they saw me with you?" Zeke answered without hesitation. "They won't see you. Where I live, there's no one around. Anyone passing by got lost." That thought loosened her shoulders. No one would point at her. No one would judge. The sun stretched their shadows as they walked downhill. Ada moved closer to him, not out of fear, but because distance didn't make sense anymore. She noticed how he held the rope tighter on narrow ground, how he leaned slightly toward her when the footing got tricky. They reached a flat stretch just as the sun dipped low on the horizon. Zeke looked around, listened to the stillness, and nodded. "We'll camp here, close to cover, far from water. Keeps visitors away." She gathered dry wood while he started the fire. When the first flames rose strong, they sat nearby. The sky faded from red into dark blue, and for the first time since being taken from her people, Ada felt something like solid ground beneath her. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. Zeke saw it in the way her eyes lit up. He didn't smile, but something in his face softened. Like the weight he carried was no longer just his. When full night came, the silence between them stopped being distance. It became a shared shelter, a new space they were learning how to hold. By morning, the fire was only a faint ring of ash when Zeke opened his eyes. The dawn filtered through the trees. Ada sat nearby, wrapped in the blanket, eyes fixed on the tree line. She didn't know he was already watching. She didn't flinch at every crack. She didn't hold her breath. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. Zeke stood, brushed off his pants, stretched his back. She turned at the sound, and her expression softened. "Did you sleep any?" she asked. "Enough," he answered. It wasn't entirely true. He'd spent most of the night listening, sorting out which noises were danger and which were harmless. But he didn't explain it. Ada didn't press. She already knew. Rest, for him, meant something different. While he readied the mule, she picked up small stones and laid a simple pattern in the dirt. 2 lines pointing northwest. 1 deeper mark showing direction. Zeke paused. "Leaving a sign?" "No, just practicing. I haven't made markings in months. My hands feel stiff." She passed her thumb across one of the lines. "If someone from my band saw this, they'd know we walked, that it wasn't a trap." Zeke nodded. That answered the question anyone might ask. Did she still hold her language, her way of saying, "I'm alive"? Stone by stone, she was reclaiming it. They got back on the trail. Grass crunched beneath their boots. The warmth came early that day. Ada walked at Zeke's pace. Her breath was steady. She wasn't panting. She took in the air with ease. After a while, Zeke lifted his hand. Ada stopped on cue. She'd learned that signal. Zeke crouched, studying a shallow print in the dirt. Someone was here before sunrise. Just one. Light footprint. Ada's stomach tightened, but she didn't panic. "You think they saw us?" "No, if they had. There'd be more signs." His tone wasn't soothing. It was honest. And that was enough. He didn't gamble on luck. He watched. He thought. They kept walking until the terrain opened wide, dotted with sage and low shrubs. Out there, with nothing to hide behind, Ada felt relief. Seeing far gave her a sense of control. And under that open sky, a new thought passed through her chest. A question about what might come, about walking beside a man who never claimed her, never demanded. What if this wasn't just a step between storms? What if it was a place to stay? The path opened toward the west. Ada broke the silence. If your home's that far from everything, how do you get what you need? Zeke adjusted the mule's rope. Now and then I ride down to a settlement, most times farther than the market where I saw you. I trade hides, tools I make, meat. I don't eat much. Don't need much either. It didn't surprise her, but it filled in another gap. How did he survive without anyone? What if he got sick? How did he get through winter with no voices, no shared fire? Those questions stayed lodged in her chest, like thorns under the skin. By midday, the sun was high overhead. Their shadows were no more than lines beneath their boots. Zeke slowed his pace. Without looking at her, he murmured, "You're quiet today." "So are you," she replied. He let out a soft breath, almost a smile, but it didn't quite form. As her fingers brushed through her tangled hair, a few feathers fell onto the grass. Ada Redhawk stared at them for a moment. She didn't know whether to pick them up or leave them, like they were pieces of a past that didn't weigh the same anymore. When she stepped back into the cabin, she found a folded shirt and a pair of pants on the table. They were clearly Zeke Callahan's, big, thick, patched, but clean. There was also a strip of cloth that could serve as a belt. He didn't know if she'd want them, but he left them in plain sight. When she came in, Zeke stepped back, giving her space. "They'll fit well enough, till we find something better," he said. Ada touched the fabric with her fingertip. The stitching was solid. She asked carefully, "Why do you have extra clothes?" Zeke took a deep breath. "A friend left it," Zeke said. "He used to pass through now and then. Never stayed long anywhere. One day he left, and never came back. No further explanation was needed. It was enough for anyone to understand that another human being had been there before. Brief, without holding on. Ada changed behind a blanket hung in the corner, creating a bit of privacy. When she came out, the shirt was loose, and the pants, tightened with the strip of fabric, let her move without feeling like the cloth was pressing into her the way it used to. She no longer wore something that reminded her of unwanted hands. Zeke looked at her for only a second. Not with judgment, just recognition. "You look more comfortable," he murmured. "I feel different," she answered. She couldn't explain it, just knew that freedom weighs different when it doesn't hurt. Zeke stoked the fire in the stove and set a pot of water to warm. The smell of smoke and warm metal filled the cabin. Minutes later, he poured some into a tin cup and handed it to her, careful not to invade her space. Ada held it with both hands. They sat across from each other, separated by the hand-built wooden table. "You haven't asked what I want to do now that we're here," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you knew," he replied. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I do know I don't want to keep running." Zeke looked at her with steady calm. "Then you're not gonna run?" A brief silence. Only the firewood cracking. She set the cup on the table. "Last night, you said this cabin doesn't ask anything of you. What do you expect from it now?" Zeke glanced around the room, as if reading it with his whole body. "Peace," he said. "A place where I can think without someone else deciding for me. Where things don't break just because someone else chose wrong." Ada let the words settle in. "And me being here? Does it change that?" "Changes the silence," he said plainly. "But it's not a bad thing." His honesty settled over her like a warm blanket. She'd feared being a burden, feared becoming weight. Knowing that wasn't the case loosened something inside her that had been wound tight for far too long. While Zeke went outside to fetch more wood, Ada walked around the cabin. She touched the surfaces, the shelf, the window frame, the rough wood of the table. She stopped beside the bed. Her fingers ran across the patchwork quilt, sewn from mismatched scraps. She wondered, silently, where would she sleep? What would it mean to share a roof? How long could she stay without feeling like she owed something? Zeke returned, brushing dust off his sleeves. He saw her standing by the bed. "Can you sleep there tonight?" he asked gently. "I'll take the porch." She turned, surprised. "The porch is cold." "I've slept there plenty," he assured. "If you're here, you get the safe place." Ada's throat tightened. She tried to object. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "But I want to." No more questions were needed. That answered what any listener might wonder, whether he expected closeness, if he wanted something in return. He didn't. His boundaries were clear. His intentions, too. And for the first time since she was torn from her home, fear made room for something new. Small, quiet, and deep. Trust. When night fell, Zeke stepped out onto the porch to settle in. Ada watched from the window. His slow movements, the way he arranged everything with purpose, the peace in how he accepted her presence, without asking anything. That night, she lay down on the bed and wrapped herself in the quilt. The cabin was silent. Just the pop of the fire. And for the first time in months, she closed her eyes without expecting violence when she woke. Outside, Zeke leaned back against the porch post, his rifle resting beside his boots. He wasn't watching her because she couldn't protect herself. He did it because the world had already failed her too many times, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. The first sound Ada heard that morning was the gentle crackle of firewood, then the soft scuff of boots on the porch. She opened her eyes slowly. The warmth of the quilt covered her like a new kind of shield. For a moment, she breathed without fear. She sat up slowly, listening. Zeke's steps approached. When he came in, he carried the scent of dawn. Pine, damp earth, a trace of smoke. He hung up his hat without a sound. "Did you sleep well?" he asked in a low voice. "I slept," she answered, and it showed on her face. It was true. She had proof of it now. No nightmares, no jolts awake. Just rest. Zeke nodded. Something inside him eased, though his face barely showed it. "The fire's strong. Water's warm for tea." Ada set the quilt aside and stood. She stretched her arms. Her joints moved without pain. That morning felt different. The first without yelling, without hands pushing her, without demands. She braced herself on the table. Zeke noticed, said nothing. He began crushing dry leaves for tea, giving her space to move at her pace. She looked at him and understood something new. He honored silence, not out of fear of saying the wrong thing, but because he knew speaking too soon could wound just the same. After tea, Zeke stepped outside to check the animals. Ada followed him to the porch, folding her arms as the cold bit her skin. The mule stood by the trough, flicking its ears. Zeke ran a hand along its neck, checking the coat and harness. Ada rested her hands on the post. "I want to help," she said. He turned his head slowly. "You don't have to work today." "I know," she replied. "I want to." For the first time since she arrived, something warm crossed Zeke's face. Not a smile, but something softened in his eyes. "Then we'll start with something easy," he said. He showed her how to fill the water trough using a bucket hanging near the shed. It was a small task, but for Ada, it was grounding. Every bucket of water affirmed her place. As she worked, her gaze lingered on the corral, the tools, the fence posts. There was a question that hadn't left her since the day before, and one any listener might wonder too. Was she truly free? Or was this freedom lined with invisible edges? Ada Redhawk set the bucket aside. She looked toward the fence, measuring carefully. "How far can I walk from the cabin before it worries you?" she asked. Zeke Callahan thought for a moment before answering. "As far as you can still see the cabin," he said. "Past that stand of oaks, the ground drops into a ravine. If something happened to you out there, it'd be hard to reach you." Ada followed the direction with her eyes. "So, I can walk where I want?" "You can do what you decide," he answered calmly. He didn't add warnings, didn't tie her down with promises. He simply offered freedom. That one simple word hurt and healed her at the same time. It didn't come wrapped in permission or obligation. It was a choice, and it had been so long since she'd had one. Feeling it again overwhelmed her from the inside. After checking on the mule, Zeke went to the shed and returned with a small basket. "Let's go gather branches under the aspens. After cold nights, there's always good ones that fall." Ada walked behind him, feeling the soft earth beneath the borrowed boots. Up close, the aspens were taller than she remembered, their bark marked by years. As she picked up a dry branch, she noticed an old scar on one of the trunks. A clean cut, almost faded. "Did you cut here once?" she whispered. "Once. Needed wood bad. That week, a hard storm hit." "Do storms come often?" "Some. But this valley usually takes the worst of it. The cabin holds up just fine." And that filled a gap anyone might have, knowing the cabin wasn't fragile. As they gathered branches, something pressed against Ada's chest until it took shape. "How did your brothers die?" Zeke rose slowly. His expression shifted before he spoke. He placed the branch in the basket. "A fight in a saloon. They tried to calm it down. Someone panicked, pulled a trigger without thinking. I wasn't there. When I got there, it was already too late." Ada lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." He shook his head gently. "No need to be. Life turned before I was ready. That's all." His voice didn't crack, but the weight was there. Deep, where it doesn't show. Ada understood that he carried the guilt not for what he did, but for what he couldn't stop. And silently, she recognized that wound. Some guilt doesn't belong to you, but still stays. Later, she asked, "And the friend who left the clothes?" "He went north, took a job on a freight line, needed more people around than I could give. I didn't hear from him again." That simple sentence said a lot. Zeke didn't hold on. He didn't claim what wasn't his. When the basket was full, they headed back to the cabin. Ada set it by the porch while he watched the sky. Every cloud, every trace of light. The frost from dawn melted into small drops on the ground. "You look at the land like it talks to you," she said. "Almost does," he replied. "What's it saying now?" "That the weather's easy, no riders, roads are quiet, a good day to settle in." And he didn't say, "Spend the night." He didn't say, "Stay while you heal." He said, "Settle in," and that changed something in her. Inside the cabin, Ada swept the floor with a small broom. Zeke trimmed the wick of the oil lamp. Each task filled the silence with purpose. Zeke paused for a moment. "If someday you want to change something here, just say it." Ada looked at him, puzzled. "Change? Why would I?" "Because you live here now," he said. Those words sank deeper than he realized. She thought it was temporary, a shelter for a few days, but what she had just heard was permanence. Later, Ada walked the land around the cabin. The ground stretched in quiet. She saw animal tracks, Zeke's trail dragging firewood, and to the west, a disturbed patch, an old garden. "Do you grow food?" she asked when he came closer. "Sometimes. Corn, beans, squash, if the weather's kind. Didn't plant since last spring. Will you plant again?" Zeke took his time. "Maybe. If it's two of us, it'll be easier." And in that phrase, Ada felt something stir inside. Planting meant future, and future meant staying. She looked at the empty soil, but no longer saw abandonment. She saw possibility. As the sun fell, Ada followed him to the porch. She paused at the doorway, looked at the quiet inside. "Zeke," she said softly. He turned to her. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe anywhere again." "You are," he answered, with that same steady clarity. "I didn't think anyone would ever let me choose my future again. You choose every part of it." And that was enough. Firmness without pressure, truth without promises. Ada didn't smile. Not yet. But her gaze lost its edge. There was a breath in her. Something new. While Zeke went inside to prepare supper, she lingered on the porch for a few seconds. The warm evening breeze brushed her skin. The land rested in calm. The cabin stood firm, and inside lived a man who had given her something no one else ever had. A place where her voice mattered. After so long running, she stepped inside. Not as a shadow, not as a desperate survivor, but as someone who could imagine the beginning of another life. The last light of day faded behind the hill, leaving a blue haze over the valley. They ate something simple, but the mood was different. It wasn't the fire that warmed the cabin. It was the way she moved inside it, no longer hiding. Ada washed the tin dishes by the stove, using the warm water he had heated. Meanwhile, Zeke arranged the firewood for the night. He checked windows, listened to the air, felt the earth, all with the calm that comes from routine. Ada placed her hands on the table and took a deep breath. She knew anyone hearing her story would have questions. What was the cabin like inside? Was solitude a refuge or a danger? How did someone spend winters out here? What did a man like him do when the nights got long? Everything was starting to make sense. "Are the winters hard up here?" she asked, drying her hands. Zeke placed the last log near the stove. He wiped his forehead with his forearm. "Hard enough to freeze the trough. Wind comes down strong from the mountains. The cabin holds, but you gotta be ready beforehand." Zeke Callahan opened a drawer and showed Ada Redhawk the contents. Dried herbs, strips of cured meat, chunks of fat, some handmade candles. That was how he got through the long winter nights. She looked into the drawer like someone staring at a silent pact. Preparation, persistence, and practiced loneliness. "You do all this alone, every year?" she whispered. "Until now," he replied, closing the drawer gently. It wasn't a claim. It was a quiet way of accepting that her presence, though recent, was already shifting the rhythm of a life built on silence. After dusting off the wood and wiping the table, Ada stepped over to the window. Outside, the darkness was complete. The open land felt too still for someone who had spent years hiding. "Does anything ever come close to the cabin at night?" she asked, still staring out. "Coyotes sometimes," Zeke replied, sitting on the edge of the bed as he oiled his rifle. "Deer at the start of fall. A stray cow if the drought hits hard. But nothing that'll bother you if you're in here with me." Ada swallowed. "And people?" Zeke looked up. "Folks don't make it out here without a reason, and if they do, they don't knock unless they know who's inside." "And what if someone does know you?" "No one's looking for me," he said evenly. "Those who once did, gave up years ago." That certainty led her to another question, one she couldn't avoid. You said your brothers died in a fight. But what happened after? Why didn't you stay in town? Zeke set the rifle beside him, laced his fingers together, and the cabin filled with a silence that wasn't cold. It was full of story. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. I stayed just long enough to bury them, he said finally, in a low voice. But every corner of that town reminded me where they used to be. Every sound, every shadow took me back to the night I wasn't there. I couldn't breathe right. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, like the dust from that day was still on his skin. So I left. Ada stepped a little closer, not to console, but just to be near the pain he was finally letting show. Did anyone try to stop you? A few, he said with a faint grimace. But they didn't understand. I didn't walk away from duty. I walked away from grief. That's not the same. And she understood. She knew how grief etched itself into gestures, how it hardened silence. She recognized that old shadow in him. Zeke got up and went to the back window, adjusted the blanket they used as a curtain. Clouds coming in from the ridge. We might get wind tonight. Ada returned to the stove. She placed another log on the fire. The flame flared, lighting up a corner she hadn't seen clearly before. Under the bed, almost hidden, was a small wooden box. What's that? She asked, eyes fixed on it. Zeke noticed, hesitated, then pulled it out. Old stuff? Nothing dangerous. He set it on the table and opened the lid. Inside, faded letters, a pocket watch with no chain, a strip of cloth wrapped around a small eagle feather, delicate, worn. Ada touched the feather. Whose was it? My brother Boone found it, said it stood for strength. He always carried it. So, he believed in signs? He believed in keeping things that mattered, Zeke said the world only takes what you let go of. And then she understood why that box was rarely opened. It wasn't a shrine, it was a container. A place where memories lived quietly, without spilling into the present. Ada closed the box with care. Thank you for showing it to me. You asked, was all he said. The wind brushed against the walls with a low whistle. Ada stepped to the bed, pulled back the quilt. And there it was. An extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. You put it there, she murmured. Figured you might want another layer, he said, adjusting the lamp, or something to cover with if the wind kicks up. She looked at him. You think of everything. Zeke shook his head. Just the things that might make life less hard for you. Ada turned to face him. Zeke, she said, her voice steady. I feel safe here. I haven't felt that in a long time. He didn't say anything, just nodded. He knew that was more fragile than any promise. He settled in to sleep on the porch, just like the night before. But before he stepped out, she spoke again. Would you sleep in here tonight? Zeke stopped with his hand on the door handle. I'm not going to be afraid. Not of you. He let the words sit there, not rushing. Then he shook his head gently. Not tonight. You need that space more than I do. She didn't argue. She understood. It wasn't rejection. It was respect. When the door closed, the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The fire threw soft shadows on the wood. Outside, Zeke settled beneath the stars. He wasn't keeping watch out of mistrust, but because the world had already failed her too many times. Listeners might wonder if Ada still thought of her sister, if feeling safe somehow betrayed her loss. But the answer was clear. Grief can live beside hope. One doesn't cancel the other. That night, she slept without fear, warm beneath the quilt, breathing without flinching. And outside, Zeke stayed awake, even though the night stayed quiet. At dawn, a thin line of light slipped through the window. The air was still. On the porch, the wood creaked softly as he stretched. Ada didn't rise suddenly. She let the morning find her there, in a place that was no longer just a shelter, but maybe a home. Her heartbeat settled into a calm rhythm. The room was warm, undisturbed. She sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall to her waist. From the doorway she saw him, his breath making small clouds in the cold. His hand resting near the rifle, not out of fear, but out of habit. She walked to the porch, her bare feet touching the cold wood. Zeke turned and gave a slight nod, as if just seeing her awake was enough to start the day. "Morning," he said in a hoarse voice. "You didn't sleep?" "Slept just enough to hear if anything came." "Nothing did," she whispered. Then she asked what many would have carried since the beginning. "Are you going to stay up every night, just so I can sleep?" Zeke held her gaze a long moment. He understood what she was really asking. "Not always," he said finally. "No promises, no flourishes. Just truth." "Just until you're safe enough not to worry," Zeke Callahan said. "And you're close to that. I can see it." Ada Redhawk's shoulders loosened. She didn't know how to answer a kindness so clean, so free of demands, so she stepped to the porch's edge and let her gaze wander across the valley. The early light revealed something new, a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. "There's a fire out there," she said. Zeke saw it too. "Campfire. Too small to be a town. Maybe hunters. They're far enough not to concern us." "Do people cross these hills?" Ada asked. "Sometimes, when the seasons shift. But they usually don't come this far, unless they get lost." Then Ada asked what anyone might have wondered. "If someone made it out here, would you send them away?" Zeke kept his eyes on the horizon. "Depends who it is," he answered plainly. "But no one's going to touch you, not here." Her breath evened out. That certainty, spoken without raising his voice, gave her back a kind of calm she thought was lost. She went inside and started preparing a simple breakfast. Ada sliced dried meat, dropped it into the pan, and let the scent fill the room. Zeke watched her. Her movements were no longer timid, but sure. She no longer felt like a stranger. She was someone beginning to belong. After they ate, Ada looked again at the wooden box. This time she didn't open it. She simply laid her hand on the lid. "You said your brother kept that feather for strength," she murmured. "You keep something for the same reason." Zeke pulled a leather cord from his pocket. Hanging from it was an old brass button. "It came off my father's coat," he explained. "I carry it when I need to go far." Ada took a step closer. "What did he teach you?" Zeke took a breath. "That a man's word is worth more than anything he owns, and that you stay beside the ones who need you, even when it's hard." The words settled inside Ada like puzzle pieces finally falling into place. There were the answers to his silence, his presence, his patience. "You've done that for me," she said. "I know," he answered, "and I'll keep doing it if you want me to." Then Ada took the fabric belt, holding up the borrowed pants. Her hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, from certainty. "Zeke," she whispered. He stopped like a man who senses something irreversible. "I want to stay." He didn't react right away. He just tensed, like he was hearing something he'd wished for years but never dared to imagine. "Stay. How?" he asked slowly. Ada lifted her face, carrying a new kind of dignity. Here, in this cabin, on this land, with you, not because you bought me, not out of fear, because I choose this. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the beginning of something. Zeke stepped toward her. Slowly, leaving space in case she wanted to pull back. She didn't move. "If you stay," he said, "this house is as much yours as it is mine." "That's what I want," she replied. Zeke let out the breath he'd been holding. He reached out his hand, waiting. She gave him hers. It wasn't a promise or a vow. It was a choice. Human. Deep. And then came the inevitable question. "So now what?" she asked. "What are we going to build together?" Zeke looked out the window, then looked back at her. "Whatever we want," he said. "Grow a garden, fix the fence, get the cabin ready for winter. And if one day someone asks who I am?" Zeke didn't answer. He waited. "My name is Ada," she said firmly, "and I want my story to continue here." Zeke smiled. Real, almost shy. "Then Ada, it'll be." He walked over to a shelf, took out a carving tool, and handed it to her. "If you want this to be your home, carve your name into the beam. That's how I marked mine." She walked to the doorway, placed her fingers on the wood. Then the chisel. A deep A. Each mark was a piece of freedom regained. Zeke stood beside her, laid his rough hand gently over hers. Just for a second. "Welcome home," he whispered. The words hit deep, like something that heals from the inside. That day, they checked the roof, reinforced the corral. The column of distant smoke disappeared behind the mountain, and no one ever came looking for her again. They let her go. The way you let go of the past. At noon, the valley opened up before them. Ada walked with a steady stride, not like someone surviving, but like someone building. Zeke walked beside her, his hand just brushing hers, not guiding, not holding, just walking alongside. And then something new happened. Ada no longer feared tomorrow. She only felt peace, and the clarity of having finally found a place she chose, and a man who didn't save her, but simply stayed. If this story moved you, we invite you to discover more true stories of the Old West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God gave those who paved the way. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us again through this untamed land. Thank you.